Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network GRUNG Week in Review. This show was recorded on Sunday, March 13, 2022. I'm Asbed Bedrosian, and today we're going to talk about the following major topics. Renewed hostilities in Artsakh. In the past couple of weeks, Aliyev has initiated new hostilities in Artsakh. We'll talk about that and how it's shaping up there. An update on Ukraine. After 3 weeks of fighting, what's the latest in this crisis? And Foreign Minister Mirzoyan went to Antalya. What was achieved there? To talk about these issues, we have with us Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a lecturer in history at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. His research focuses on the history of Soviet Armenia and the Caucasus. Hi, Pietro. How are you doing?
Asbed, I'm doing fantastic. It's great to be joining you again.
Yes, nice having you back. Let's just jump right in. In the past couple of weeks, Aliyev has initiated new hostilities in Artsakh. On March 4th, Baku began attacking the villages of Khramort and Norshen with not just small arms, but also mortars. And it has continued and expanded its attacks on these villages and many more, and I'll list them in the show notes. Pietro, how do you interpret Baku's latest steps? What is Aliyev's game here?
Well, I think Azerbaijan is intent on, eventually their ultimate aim is to secure the entirety of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. I think that is the aim, and they're putting pressure on the population in various ways. So you mentioned, of course, the shelling on the villages, but it doesn't stop there. So last Monday, the Kuwait and the Caspian followed this act by cutting off gas supplies between Armenia and Artsakh. And the extra demand for the energy could not be met by electricity, leading to widespread blackouts and power cuts. Nearly 80%, to give you an idea, Asbed, nearly 80% of the population is affected by what's going on there now with the blackouts. Mm-hmm. And starting from tomorrow, schools and kindergartens will be closed. Hospitals also may have impaired services. So that's what we're looking at. Plus, consider this. Baku also initiated this organized campaign aimed at criticizing and undermining the Russian peacekeeping presence in Artsakh. They attempted to incite panic among the Armenian population by claiming that the Russian peacekeeping forces are going to leave. They are spreading kind of fake news that the Russians, that their withdrawal is imminent due to the war in Ukraine. During the course of the war in Ukraine, our listeners may not know this, but actually on March 7th, the Artsakh authorities sent humanitarian aid for civilians in Ukraine through the Russian peacekeepers. So this aid would be distributed to Ukrainian civilians through the Russian forces in Ukraine. And in response, the Russian Defense Ministry publicly acknowledged Stepanakert for its friendly gesture, but the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry criticized Moscow for even using the term Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's not even that they're criticizing Moscow for, let's say, even using the term Artsakh, but using the term Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, right?
Right?
I saw that.
Noting that there is no administrative or territorial unit of any kind called Nagorno-Karabakh on the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan. So that's where we are. But the bottom line is they're trying to use the context of Russia's involvement right now in Ukraine to gain a greater foothold in Nagorno-Karabakh, to possibly to pressure the population to leave, maybe even take it over by force, to intimidate the population, to also kind of throw down the gauntlet to the Russian peacekeepers, and I think that they're sensing that maybe is Russia weak? Can we challenge that, push against that? And actually,
it seems to me that they're
will
testing the water right now to see how much attention span Russia has towards the south.
They're definitely testing the waters, and I think they're going to be testing Russia's patience with this too. I think that it is a very risky move on the part of Baku to do this, because if they continue to do this, it's not going to end well for Baku. But if they think that this is a smart strategy, I think that it is something that will eventually elicit a very strong Russian response if this keeps up.
What has been the response from official Yerevan? Have you heard from the Prime Minister? Have you heard from the Foreign Ministry?
I've not heard from the Foreign Ministry. I've not heard much. In fact, I haven't heard much of anything. I think there's been zero reaction, as a matter of fact, from the Foreign Ministry. The president-elect, our good friend Vahagan, when he was asked about it, he said, so what if Azerbaijan is shooting We will not stray from our plans. I don't know what plans
And
those
what are the plans?
What is he? I don't even know what plans he's thinking about. But then, of course, we
Mhm.
have our good friend Pashinyan, who flew to France in the midst of everything. And at a government session, he basically urged against making any judgments or condemnations and just
Mhm.
focus on solving problems, which
Right.
actually, that is the thing that Pashinyan has been worst
He's
at.
basically been letting everybody go with complete impunity. Like the enemy never
Well,
gets
yeah.
punished, never even gets condemned.
But not only that, I mean, when we talk about, basic matters of governance, we're talking about solving problems. I mean, that's in the basic job description of being the prime minister. He can't even solve the problems.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's not that he can't solve the problems. Actually, he's not able to. He's such an
Hmm.
ineffective leader. He's not able to solve any problems. So when he's talking about focus on solving problems, first of all, most of the problems Armenia has today are exactly caused by him. So,
Yeah.
so, so I think that this is ridiculous that he's making such remarks. But
Well, my concern is that Armenia doesn't even have the military ability to respond to any of these issues.
well, look at the turnover in the defense ministry. I mean, Pashinyan has limited the ability of Armenia to give an adequate military response, and also, if you go even back to the 44-day war, that severely limited the defense capabilities of Armenia.
Right.
So Pashinyan, I mean, in all respects, it's a complete disaster in terms of his response.
Yeah. Did you see on Thursday that the EU Parliament issued a resolution condemning Baku's efforts to destroy Armenian cultural heritage? It accused it of instituting a state-level policy of Armenophobia. What do you think about that?
In one respect, it's good that they're acknowledging this. I
Mm-hmm.
think that is fine. But even with the recent hostilities in
Mm-hmm.
Artsakh that we've been seeing, that the EU is still delivering both sidism. I mean, they're still kind of saying, the sides need to get together. They had one EU official who basically said that, there are power cuts and Azerbaijan and Armenia should find ways to resolve the issue fast to avoid further humanitarian crisis. So again, it's about Armenia, Azerbaijan, but they don't actually point the finger at who really is responsible here, which is exactly Baku. And I think that, again, we find ourselves in the same circle.
Yeah, for me, it's just a lot of talk and not enough walk. They're being very diplomatic. They're being very Eurocratic in a sense.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I
And
love that term, Eurocratic.
yeah, meanwhile, from the United States, I don't know if you saw that there was an earmark of about 45 million for Armenia and 2 million for Artsakh. But it's basically almost like money to have the Armenians shut up and talk about something else than these issues that we're mentioning
And
here.
actually, and frankly, Osbeth, this is something that people here in Yerevan are focusing on a lot. I mean, if you go, like, for instance, to the Zoravor Surbatsvatsin church, I was there this morning. A lot of people were there lighting candles, praying. I mean, just, of course, many people already do that on Sunday in an Armenian church, but especially this Sunday, people they really had Artsakh on their minds. So this is a very serious thing. You can't just give Armenians money to forget about it, because this is their national survival,
Yeah.
ultimately, at the end of the day.
Yeah, for me, the bottom line from this conversation is that Azerbaijan is testing the water with a Russia that is at war in Ukraine and that maybe doesn't have the diplomatic and military attention span for the South Caucasus. So we'll see how that's going to pan out. Okay.
Yeah.
Moving forward, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. The war in Ukraine continues, obviously. According to the UN, over 2.5 million people have fled the country since the beginning of hostilities on February 24. Over 3,000 combatants have died in the war, disproportionately on the Ukrainian side, and over 500 civilians have been killed in the crosshairs of the conflict. What do you think, Pietro? After nearly 3 weeks of fighting, where are we in this war in the Ukraine today?
Well, the Russian forces continue to advance, and they are meeting resistance from Ukrainian forces. It's important to know who these Ukrainian forces are, because in most cases, we're not talking about the regular Ukrainian army. We're talking about these far-right, right-wing nationalist battalions fighting the Russians in these cities. In terms of citizens' resistance of ordinary Ukrainian citizens, much has been made about this in the Western press, but in reality, there isn't as much of that as people think, really. And people in these cities in Ukraine are just trying as much as possible to move on with their daily lives amidst the war. Many of them are fleeing as refugees, and so we have that. But the Russians.
So in the major cities, are businesses open?
Actually, yes. I mean, so there was a remarkable dispatch I read the other day from a resident of Kiev, on Facebook. And actually, he was saying that, well, there are a couple of suburbs, and now this was a few days ago. So, developments are dramatically changing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
he was
obviously.
saying that two suburbs are completely destroyed, but in the city of Kiev itself, shops are still functioning. People are still getting on with their daily lives. We don't have people running around the city with Kalashnikovs like you see in the Western media. So people are just trying to, as much as possible in these extraordinary circumstances,
So,
exist
so
and make through.
Miss Ukraine is not behind some sandbags with a
No,
Kalashnikov?
no. That's yes, it's completely
Fake.
distorted reality. Yeah, fake news. And so no. This is not the case at all. People are they want this to be over and soon.
Pietro, I was listening to NPR yesterday about the war, and they mentioned that thousands of foreign fighters have responded to Zelensky's call for anyone to join the resistance against the Russian invasion. Now, in the Armenian media, we've seen a couple of mentions that Turkey is again injecting Syrian mercenaries in this war. Is this true? Do we know more about these quote unquote thousands of non Ukrainians who are now joining the war?
Well, first of all, when we talk about foreign fighters in Ukraine, we have to break down, first of all, whose side are they fighting on?
Mm-hmm.
Because number one, you have foreign fighters fighting, of course, for Ukrainian side, thanks to Zelensky's invitation. Also, Putin the other day was opening it up for foreigners to fight on the
Mm-hmm.
Russian side as well, too. But mostly we're talking about the Ukrainian side if we're talking about foreign fighters. Now,
Yeah,
in
but who are
terms
these
of
people?
well, the composition of them, and then this was my next point, we would have to kind of break it down country by country, but the group that most concerns me are the Syrian fighters. So there are reports now, and I was reading this in the Armenian press, that the Syrian mercenaries who were fighting in Artsakh are being transferred by Erdogan
Mm-hmm.
to Ukraine to fight in the Ukrainian war. And I think that would be that would just add more instability to the picture. And I cannot see how that would end very well.
Yeah, I don't have any verification on that, so hopefully over the coming week we'll see some more information in the media about that. Turning to the diplomacy a little bit, the Russian and Ukrainian sides have been meeting. They've met, I think, 3 times in Belarus. On NPR, when I was listening to the same bit, I heard them call these conversations, quote unquote, inconsequential. Have these talks yielded any results,
No,
Pietro?
they're not inconsequential. I think that actually there is, to be quite honest, does, but it goes back to this idea that hope dies last.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So we are in, like I said, a really, really bad situation right now. That we're in an actual hot war in
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine. I've been warning about that in the podcast for a while. And any kind of peace talks, any kind of diplomacy, even at this late stage, should be embraced with open arms. I think that these talks, from what I have been reading, have yielded some results. And that I've been hearing things along the lines that, well, when these talks began, the positions of the Russian and Ukrainian sides were far apart, but now they've become ever so more closer.
Well, can you say a little bit about the proposals on both sides and where they started and how they've come a little closer together?
Well, the main proposals come from the Russian side because Russia is the one that has the
Right.
major grievances. So, number one being, of course, the issue of NATO. So,
Mm-hmm.
the top Russian concern that they put out on the table right away is Ukraine, at the very least, this is the demand that the Russians want, that Ukraine must be a neutral state. It cannot join any military alliance.
Mm-hmm.
So, no NATO. And right now, Ukraine, it's actually quite ridiculous. So, Ukraine in the constitution, NATO is baked into the Ukrainian constitution. After Maidan,
That is just unbelievable.
it's absolutely screwy. I never
This is what
saw
happens when
a
you
country
let
like this.
foreigners write your constitution.
Absolutely. And I cannot imagine like a case where, in Armenia's constitution, let's say, we would
Mm-hmm.
have CSTO. Even in the Constitution of the United States, NATO is not even in the Constitution of the United States of America.
Right.
So this is unprecedented for a country to put NATO as like a founding article in your constitution or
Mm-hmm.
something like this. Is absolutely ridiculous. So number one, what the Russians want is a neutral Ukraine. Ukraine that is not militarized, Ukraine that is not affiliated with any kind of military alliance. They also would like to have Ukraine adopt Russian as a second state language in deference to the Russian speakers in the south and the east of Ukraine. They also want Ukraine, they've added this one too, to recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Now that's a bit of a tough one for Ukrainians, but
Mm-hmm.
they're adding that too, and also to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. Now that might be something that they could negotiate on.
Right. That seems
Maybe
to
there
be.
could be like some kind of like federation between Ukraine and Lugansk and Donetsk. Something like that could be. So at that point, we're getting like more into like negotiating
Yeah,
points.
if their
Then they talk
constitution
about
is rewritten to make the Ukraine a federation just like Russia is, then it'll be a federation of autonomous regions, let's
yeah,
say. And
or if you will, I mean, when we talk about federation, federal states, actually, I wrote about this in 2014 during the earlier Ukrainian war. I said, you know, Ukraine can use Germany as a model
yeah.
because modern day Germany is comprised of different states like Bavaria,
Hmm.
you know, and so on and so forth. So, or Saxony, let's say. And that would be a potential model they could follow with Donbass and all these different regions of Ukraine. Also, Putin has on the table denazification. He doesn't want to have any more far right groups running around Ukraine.
Hmm.
He wants to kind of get them under wraps. He wants to see a Ukraine with a rule of law. And then finally, demilitarization. So no offensive weapons at all on the territory of Ukraine. And recently, there was even a controversy with revelations about development of biological weapons in Ukraine
Hmm.
that have been kind of supported by the United States. And there was a very interesting Q&A there with Marco Rubio and Victoria Nuland, where Nuland, in a very kind of halting response, revealed that, in fact, there had been facilities working on bioweapons in Ukraine.
Mm. Well, speaking of all of that, there have been calls from several public figures in the West, especially in the US and the UK, to supply Ukraine with fighter jets via Poland. Some, including former NATO Commander General Breedlove, have even called for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. What do you think about steps like this?
I don't think that these are very good steps. I think that they're very dangerous and they could lead us to the brink of nuclear war. I mean, what General Breedlove is proposing would most certainly lead to the United States shooting down, or NATO shooting down Russian planes over Ukraine. And I
Yeah,
cannot see that ending very well for the Western world. Or actually, not only for the Western world, I can't see
for
that
the whole
ending very
world.
well for the whole world. Fortunately, Washington has stated that it does not intend to set up no-fly zones over Ukraine, so we can all sleep soundly at night. However, you know, it has given some mixed signals about sending fighter jets to
Hmm.
the conflict zone in
Right.
Ukraine. But overall, I think that on that issue too, I think that they have ultimately realized this too would not be very helpful. I think that
I
this
don't think
would.
it's going to make any difference in the war. Actually, I think it makes more sense for the military-industrial complex that, they will send all these MiG-29s from Poland, which is a NATO member, over to Ukraine, flush them out of the system so that the United States can sell new fighters to Poland.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a business. I mean,
Yeah,
NATO
this
is
is
a
a
business at
business.
the end of the day. So
Yeah. What's the impact on Armenia of all this war? Are you seeing a lot of Russians arriving in Armenia and Yerevan?
oh, yes, I am. I'm seeing many of them on the streets.
Hmm.
You're seeing, okay, so at first it was not so noticeable to me because Russians and Slavs are part of they're part of the scene in Yerevan as it is. But lately, since the war in Ukraine, their numbers have increased significantly. They're
Hmm.
very visible in the city center.
Interesting.
And yeah, and if you talk to them, many of them are tourists, but there are also many who have a good chunk of them
Hmm.
who have come to sit out the instability in Ukraine and the potential economic fallout in
Yeah.
Russia itself
Yeah.
from the sanctions. But that being said, the vast majority of them, if you talk to them, plan to go back home. They love Yerevan, they love Armenians, they love Mount Ararat, they love Konyak, they love the Symphony of Stones, Lake Sevan, you name it. But at the end of the day, in their heart of hearts, these are people with Russian souls, right? So
Yeah.
they love Russia, they miss Russia, and so they want to go back ultimately in the end.
Just a couple of days ago, we were talking to economist and former Deputy Prime Minister Vache Gabrielian. He said one of the main differences that he's noticing is that these folks are not here for 2 or 3 weeks as tourists, but possibly for 2 or 3 months, somewhat of an
Yeah,
extended stay in Armenia. Many of them are also trying to establish a certain amount of work residency in Armenia so that they can work from here so that their businesses are not interrupted. So from an economic perspective, you were just mentioning, I think it'll be interesting to see if there's a little bit of a bump that Armenia experiences because of this infusion of arrivals.
and also something else too that's been happening because Russians lately have been very attracted to Yerevan. They find it to be this kind of, wonderfully exotic city, on the cusp of Europe and Asia. And what's quite interesting about it is that actually the demand for trips to Yerevan has significantly increased the travel cost to Yerevan between Russia and Armenia. So especially before the Ukrainian war, the ticket for a round trip from, let's say, Moscow or St. Petersburg to Yerevan, and back, that would cost you around maybe $200 to $300. If you're just going to do a direct flight,
And
now it probably costs you, maybe, I think, like $2,000 round trip.
2,000? I was going to guess about $400 or $500.
Well, I have a friend, actually. He was in Moscow recently from Yerevan. He went from Yerevan to Moscow, and one way the trip was about $100, and the other way was about $1,000.
Oh my God!
So yeah,
okay.
so the prices are rising, and I think that this is just a phase too. I think that eventually things will stabilize. But it is. This is what we're seeing now. And the tourists, and the Russian visitors in Yerevan, and maybe even some would like to stay longer.
Yeah,
they love the city and they love Armenians, and everybody's getting along really well, and so. I
was talking to a friend, and I was saying that if enough Russians come to Armenia and stay here for an extended period of time, Russia might declare Armenia as an independent country as well. This reminds me of all these issues that we're talking about, that earlier this week Russia announced suspension of exports of wheat and a number of other commodities to many countries. Right now, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, over 5,000 sanctions
absolutely.
Apparently against Russia. But the ban on wheat exports also apply to the Eurasian Economic Union countries. And of course, Armenia is a member of that union. So in a country that imports a large amount of its wheat, this has caused a minor amount of panic among Armenians.
Yeah.
And the government has even put out a message to its citizens to not do panic buying. Why would Russia cut wheat supplies for its allies?
Okay, so what the Russians are saying officially is that for Eurasian Union countries, they want to prevent the re-export of crops to other countries. Countries that are outside the Eurasian Economic Union, that are potentially Western countries, and so on and so forth. They don't want, or are participating in the sanctions, so they don't want any of that. And they also are rationalizing this by saying, look, we are well stocked. In most cases, you are well stocked. But this actually has set off some, like you say, panic buying, not only in Armenia, but even in the Central Asian countries. So even, Kazakhstan, it has pretty significant reserve cereal crops. But at the same time, it also imports a lot from Russia. And so they're quite concerned about this impacting them too. Also Kyrgyzstan, other members of the Eurasian Union. So it's not just a matter of Armenia specifically.
So do you think that this was a political message or just an economic consideration on the part of Russia? What is the calculation behind a temporary ban to friendly countries as well as the rest of the world?
I think that this is not a political thing. I think that this is a means mostly to kind of, stabilize things out economically. For the Eurasian Union, for Russia. At first, I was thinking in part, maybe this was a political thing for Russia to put more pressure, let's say, on Nikol Pashinyan, because, they're getting tired of Pashinyan, and especially in this environment where Russia's back is really against the wall. They're looking for support. Pashinyan, they're kind of saying, well, are you with us? Are you against us? That kind of a thing. And they're expecting more support from post-Soviet states. So there is definitely that consideration that they are getting tired of Pashinyan, especially because Pashinyan here, he's a weak leader in a very crucial part of their security infrastructure. But I think that this specific move it does not have an overt kind of political motivation behind it.
Pietro, I do have actually a question about that. Now, from my understanding, I think it's wrong to assume that we have even 3 months of supplies. Obviously, it's a secret, so normally states don't reveal how much it is. But during the war, for instance, I think Nikol himself said we have 1 to 2 months of strategic food supply. So what happens if the ban is until August 31st? That doesn't give us enough time.
To be honest, Tovik, I don't know. The biggest problem I have is that I do not have stats in front of me from right. The Armenian government to say, how many reserves do you really have in stock?
Exactly.
I would not put it past them if they were lying, because for 44 days, Artur and Hovhannisyan lied to the Armenian people. It's not inconceivable that the Armenian government would have lied would potentially lie about this as well too. Although I cannot say that for sure. So I'm not. I cannot.
Yeah.
I cannot guess. I cannot.
And none of us
give
can.
you a
None of us
firm
can.
answer on that. Yeah.
The only other thing that I think is worthwhile to think about is the ban also explicitly gives a permission for exceptions to it, and I believe that's done by some ministry. So one of the ministries then is empowered to give exceptions. I guess it's worthwhile to watch and see how this develops.
Yeah, but also I will say this, just observing in Yerevan. I mean, you can go to some. There were some grocery stores where flour was flying off the shelves. I mean, there was panic buying here. So it is. I mean, people are.
So it did have negative repercussions on a partner country, which I think that Russian planners would have taken into account. So I don't know how to explain that other than.
Well, what I think it would do, it would put more pressure on Pashinyan. I think that the Russians, to be honest, Tovik, like I said, they're getting tired of the guy. I mean, the guy really has run the country into the ground. Yeah. It's very clear he's a political failure. People are getting tired of him here in Armenia. The Russians are getting tired of him. And I think his expiration date is going to be coming, sooner than many people think. So we'll wait and see. But yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next item. Foreign Minister Arabat Mirzoyan attends Antalya Forum. So on Monday, the Armenian Foreign Ministry announced that Arabat Mirzoyan, whose name was misspelled by the Turkish media on purpose as Arabat Mirzoyan, and even a CNN Turk actually said Azarat Mirzoyan. Basically, he would attend the Antalya Diplomatic Forum in Turkey on March 11 to 13.
Hovik, do you really think that these were on purpose, or?
Yeah, I mean,
so they were actually a political slight. They actually, it's like an insult.
Sure because Ararat is in Turkey, right? So they don't want. I don't think. Anyway, frankly,
I'm surprised they didn't call him Agri Mirzoyan.
Well, actually, I'm surprised because they didn't like. They lacked a little bit of creativity because they should have said Azamat Mirzoyan, as in Borat's sidekick. Anyway. So at the same time, the forum was a point of confluence for different political actors. Sergei Lavrov made it to the forum. They had a meeting actually before the forum started with the foreign minister of Ukraine. Kuleba, yes. So I guess it was not all that unexpected that Mirzoyan would finally announce that he would attend, even though they were maintaining strategic ambiguity by sort of not announcing that they were going to attend.
I think Ararat Mirzoyan was probably the last person to know that he was going to go to this.
We've
said it for a very long time that he was going to go.
Without a doubt, I am more than sure of that.
But they didn't have the guts to say, yes, we're going to go to this thing. And and from the way that the whole thing unfolded on Monday, that Ararat Mirzoyan was, the foreign ministry said that he is going to, after all, attend. And then almost immediately, Foreign Minister Lavrov is also going to go over there. I think basically Mirzoyan received permission from Lavrov to go to Antalya because I think he was also going to be there.
I think since Kuleba and Lavrov saw that Mirzoyan is coming, they decided to go as well. And I
think it was almost the opposite, but regardless.
But anyway. in all honesty, Pietro, what took Yerevan so long to announce this? They kept saying that sort of, we have not made a decision. Is it just sort of, to minimize political issues?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, Russia and Turkey have experienced a rough patch in relations as part of the fallout from the Ukrainian war. And so I think that at that point, especially with the Straits issue, I think that it was clear that the Armenian-Turkish reconciliation process was more or less dead. But I think that somehow it was decided by Pashinyan and the Armenian government that we should resume this process and we should send Mirzoyan there to Antalya, maybe because, again, the Turkish foreign minister was advancing this idea that we can use the Antalya Forum. The guy's from Antalya, by the way. We could use the Antalya Forum to bring together Ukraine and Russia, and Turkey would look like the great peacemaker between Moscow and Kiev because they value the relationship with both of those countries. And they don't want a serious situation where they're forced to choose, really. I mean, even though they're leaning more toward Kiev, ultimately, they don't want that to be too public. So they were hoping that they could bring the two sides together in this. But actually, this was not. I was talking earlier with Hasbed Hovik about the meetings that have been making some progress between Russia and Ukraine amid this war. And actually, this particular meeting in Antalya was not one of those meetings. It was not as successful as the others. It kind of came back with very limited results, shall we say. And also, I can say the same about Mirzoyan's meeting. I didn't see much substance. I heard that it was a very, constructive meeting, but I have not heard any details.
I saw the pictures, and it looked like a frat boy reunion, to be honest. And what was interesting, I wanted to ask if either of you know this or can provide more context. Çavuşoğlu was not wearing a tie while Mirzoyan was. Are those
I absolutely noticed that.
I noticed that too. Absolutely.
So is that like a signal? I'm everything in diplomacy, I think, is, but I'm just wondering whether we're reading too much into it. That's along the lines of the Arabat thing. The other thing,
Well, no, Çavuşoğlu is of course on home turf, right? Antalya,
he's on double home turf because that's his native, city. That's his native province. So
some of the other distinguished guests, which I think are worth mentioning, Bayraktar, the energy minister. That last name should be, even though he's the minister of energy. I wonder what he talked about, using drones for peaceful purposes.
What we want, Hovik, are more merciful wars. That's what he was going to say.
More merciful, right, using drones for merciful.
Yes, absolutely. With
merciful
more
peacekeeping
wars, yes.
Another guest is Hikmet Hacıyev. I'm wondering, I think, I haven't checked, but I think his talk was titled, How to Counter Disinformation.
That's Orwellian.
Yes. Then there was Brenda Schaefer, who was preaching for, I guess,
who's who of Azerbaijani, fans right here.
Matt Bryza was there too, and I guess Brenda Schaefer. And Matt Bryza,
there we go. This is old home week right here, man.
but okay. What would they talk about? Perhaps they would praise the blown out pipeline and say, how to mercifully control energy flows and how to contain Iran by, blowing up their gas pipelines. So I don't know, totally not humiliating to be in Antalya at that time. And I'm sure that all those guests treated him with respect.
Fortunately, the Turks gave him a certain amount of cover. They didn't use his real name.
Anything else we should talk about? Kuleba and Lavrov met. Çavuşoğlu and Mirzoyan met, but I think you said that there wasn't much achieved at that meeting.
No, there wasn't much achieved. It was just kind of like he enjoyed the views of Antalya, and that was pretty much it.
NATO Secretary General was there, and there were actually some sort of heads of state of African countries. Normally, I think in the past, and maybe that's sort of my prejudice because I hadn't been paying attention, I would expect this to be like the Turkic Council states. But as I said, NATO Secretary General and Lavrov's presence there gave it more prominence. So in total, I think that this was a good opportunity for Turkey to increase its diplomatic
it's definitely an
reputation.
Annual showcase that they have. Yeah, and I think they came out looking good. That was the intention.
That was the main objective, to come out looking
absolutely.
good.
Absolutely.
And you have a beautiful city there, so why not?
Okay, we're going to conclude our topics with that. Let's talk about what is bothering us for the past week or so. Pietro, do you have something that you want to get off your chest?
Oh my God, this Ukrainian war, what we've seen with this Ukrainian war, what I want to rant about is Russophobia or Russophobia. What we've seen with this Ukrainian war has been an unprecedented rise of Russophobia, the worst case of this in the Western world. And in the United States in particular, since the first Red Scare. So not the Red Scare of Joe McCarthy. I'm talking about the Red Scare of 1919, 1920, right after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And the jingoism, it's very reminiscent, if not even worse than the Iraq War. It's pretty bad. This is not just about condemning the Russian government or Putin, although the Western media, especially the American media, is obsessed with Putin personally, almost to a ridiculous level. But we see things like, Facebook permitting anti-Russian hate speech. This is like Orwellian right now. So permitting anti-Russian hate speech, it's okay to call for the deaths of Russian soldiers. Basically, you have Netflix canceling a forthcoming series based on Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. in Cardiff, Wales, at the Cardiff Philharmonic Orchestra. They were going to have a performance of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, and that was canceled. You had, even in Manchester in the United Kingdom, an effort to remove the statue of Friedrich Engels, and they forgot he was German, not Russian. There was an effort at an Italian university in Milan to postpone a course in Dostoevsky. There are attacks on Russian embassies in the US. Sberbank is leaving Europe out of concern for the safety of its staff. You have, Russian embassies in various Western countries receiving threats, and so on and so forth. You even have, of course, this exhibition of Russian avant-garde art that was sponsored by the Hermitage's branch in Amsterdam, signed to close ahead of schedule. So the reaction against not only the Russian government, but Russian people, Russian culture, I think is beyond the pale, and I think it's really unacceptable. And I mean, we see things, it's like shades of like Hermann Hesse speaking of Dostoevsky in terms of the Asiatic Russian, this kind of a thing. And that, or it's almost like Mein Kampf. I mean, in a way.
Exactly.
So this kind of stuff.
In many respects, I think it's worse because social media has much larger penetration today than Goebbels would ever sort of dream of. He had to sell radio sets to Germans, but
and also, what did Goebbels say? The idea was if you lie enough times, it eventually becomes the truth. And you're seeing a lot of lying going on right now in the media, and eventually people are accepting it that this is true.
Peter, this is your rant, but I want to sort of interject. So the only thing is that I honestly believe that Facebook's allowing anti-Russian hate speech is a violation of law in many countries. And I would hate to see what happens to Facebook executives if they suddenly, get arrested in one of these countries where they may not be deemed very friendly in the future. It's ominous that things have come to this, but would Russia be out of line for arresting these people? Or even, allies of Russia, for instance, if any of these people visit these countries where, Russia has allies. I'm not sure.
Well, for instance, like Belarus. I mean, actually, what you're talking about, Hovik, is actually another good point. How does this impact democracy in Russia and the post-Soviet space? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that it adversely affects it. So I talked earlier on this podcast about Memorial closing down. And you can associate this with the whole foreign agent law, which is exactly associated with all these, so-called colorful revolutions in the post-Soviet space. So it is by interfering in this part of the world, Western governments are actually contributing to the erosion and the destruction of democracy. And like you said, I mean, it's also going to adversely affect like staff of Facebook or whatever. But, Russians, they don't really care anymore. I mean, Facebook is blocked in Russia.
The ban on Russian art and such things is just mind-blowing to me. I mean, just imagine that if after the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, Europe had said that no more reading of Mark Twain or Ernest Hemingway, and you can't listen to Gershwin or Copeland anymore.
Oh my God. And it's like a more extreme version of what we saw in the Iraq War with the Freedom Fries.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I mean, it's like but the jingoism, it's like out of control. I mean, and it's just awful. And actually, even you take Russians who, let's say they didn't support the war in Ukraine, now they would be behind their government after seeing how much the West hates them and hates their culture. It's going to rally more Russians around the government.
Okay. Hovik, do you have something that you would like to get off your chest?
Social media companies, it's just like the amazing power that they have is being used for evil today. And when the dust settles after this war, I believe that it's going to change the world. I don't know, in many different ways, maybe not good, maybe good, I'm not sure. But I'm seriously hoping that what we have today in terms of the status quo of like 3 or 4 social media companies, very powerful, run by sort of, Western controlled sort of
Western oligarchs.
Executives. Yeah, Western oligarchs.
Oligarchs.
Controlling hate and controlling what you think about. And it's very obvious that was the sort of intention.
And the irony, Hovik,
I hope that will change.
Is that, the irony is that, social media technically should be bringing people together. I mean, it should be cutting across boundaries of different countries. And yet it's actually creating more echo chambers, more division, more hatred.
Actually, one more thing about oligarchs. This is a statistic. 3 of the richest oligarchs in the US, Bezos, Musk, and Gates, are worth $594 billion. Okay, and that's equivalent of the richest 100 oligarchs in Russia, just as a point of reference.
Well, and also I have one more thing to say. This is a shout out. I just want to say happy 125th birthday to Yegishe Charens, the great national Armenian poet
wonderful.
and socialist
Thank you for
revolutionary.
that, Pietro.
So
Yes.
I just want to wish him
Indeed.
a happy birthday.
All right, we're going to leave it there for today on a positive note. Thank you, Pietro, and thank you for Hovik joining us just a little late in the show.
All right.
Thank you, Azbed. Thank you, Hovik. It's a pleasure being on as always.
Okay, that was our Week in Review show, and we hope it helped you catch up with some of the issues in and around Armenia from this past week. As always, we invite your feedback and your suggestions. You can find us on most social media and podcast platforms or our website, groong.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, like our pages, and follow us on social media. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.